דוקטור אווה הופמן נולדה בקרקוב להורים שהצליחו לברוח ולהסתתר בזמן המלחמה וחזרו לפולין אחריה. ב-1959 היא היגרה עם המשפחה לוונקובר, התחילה מסע ארוך של רכישת זהות ושפה חדשות, עברה מקנדה לארצות הברית, והיום אווה הופמן היא סופרת ידועה, מוערכת מאוד, מאותרת בפרסים ותוארי כבוד, היא חיברה ספרים בדיוניים ועיוניים, מסות ומאמרים רבים בעיתונים ובכתבי עת מרכזיים, היא מומחית לספרות אנגלית ואמריקאית והייתה עורכת בחירה ומבקרת במוסף הספרים של הניו יורק טיימס, בעצם מוסף הספרים החשוב ביותר בעולם. הספר הראשון שלה נקרא בתרגום עברי זרה בין מילים, חיים בשפה חדשה, ונדבר עליו, Lost in Translation. Eva, I will talk to you in English. Yes, your book, Lost in Translation, was published in 1989, and it is divided in 3 parts. The first part is called Paradise.
Indeed.
And it depicts, it tells about your childhood in Krakow before your immigration to the West. And what comes out of it is a sense of security, a sense of calm, a sense of order, of belonging, especially in harmony between the words and the words of your mother tongue and the things that you were holding in your hands. The words have the sensuality of the things you were holding. I remember you were relating to the goggle, we call it goggle moggle.
Yes,
And you call it kogel mogel in Polish, yes, but כולנו מכירים את זה. אולי אלי לא. גוגל מוגל? כן, אתה אולי מכיר. And you could sense in the word itself the warmth and the sweetness of the thing, of the drink itself. And in a way, it's a Jewish version of the Madeleine of Proust.
Yes.
But the book begins with a break. With a break, and it begins with April 1959, when you are standing on the boat that will bring you to Canada, and you write in retrospect, I feel that my life is ending. It's a notion of such crashing, definitive finality, that to me might as well mean the end of the world. And it's a beautiful concept to begin a book with the end, yes, in a way. And I
with
must
the
say,
middle, let us say, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And immigration starts with an end.
Yeah.
And if you can talk a little bit about that, and about the impact of this past on your biography and on your writing.
Right. The impact on my biography of this
and on your writing, yes.
Yes, so the book is divided into 3 sections: Paradise, Exile, and the New World. And it might seem very strange to entitle the first part, which is about growing up in post-war, post-Holocaust Poland, with parents who had both lost absolutely all members of their families, in a very impoverished country, in a country which experienced not only the Holocaust, but another enormous war, in which 3 million non-Jewish Poles died. So it might seem strange to entitle that section Paradise. But to some extent, I was describing the paradise of childhood, of the great sort of intensity of childhood perceptions, the sensuality of childhood perceptions. And indeed, paradoxically, and I don't know if it would have lasted much longer had I gone on to grow into adulthood in Poland, I did feel safe. There was my small nuclear family, my parents and my sister. and a kind of unequivocal sort of family love, family attachments, it was still a more communal culture. And even though, there were certainly complicated feelings between non-Jewish Poles and Jews, there was even there a sense of communality, a sense of solidarity. So there was all of that. There were the Polish, the village landscapes. We spent vacations in Polish villages, which I loved. There was the peasant music, which I listened to, which I loved. Recently, I don't know if this film came here, called Cold War. Did this film come here? So if any of you saw it, you know the music in that film. The music completely pierced me to the core because that was the music that I listened to in these Polish villages. So there was something, that I experienced as idyllic, and indeed, I was a kind of, linguistic child, I suppose. I loved language. I loved poetry. I loved the books that I read, but I simply loved language. I loved expressiveness. And Polish was, of course, completely incorporated into my psyche. And, it is a feature of the first language that you learn it as a child. You learn it unconsciously. And so the words in the language seem to be coeval, seem to be equivalent, seem to stand for the things they name. W.H. Auden has a very nice sort of reflection on this. W.H. Auden, the great English poet, if I have another half a moment, he says, he was English, so he imagines a very small child being taken out by a nanny and being told, look, there is the moon. And to the child, the word moon has some of the glow, some of the enchantment of the moon. He says that in order to become a writer, you then have to understand that words are not completely equivalent to things, that words are separate from things as well, but that this is the enchantment of the first language, which is very hard to replace later.
Eva, you are talking about the fact that immigration is also a decoding of codes. Yes. And you say that every immigrant is also is as well an anthropologist.
Yes.
At least an amateur. And the second chapter in your book is called Exile.
Yes.
And it's about a period where there is a disconnection between words and reality.
Yes.
And there is a very interesting story that you tell, which is a great story about displacement. You describe the moment when you speak about Poland in your school, in the class, and you look at the map, and in the map you see Canada because you are in Canada, and on the other side you see Poland because it's on the map, and then you understand something that yes. You are no more the center of the world. And yes. Tell us about that experience, because the experience of not being anymore the center of the world is a very immigrantish experience, I think.
Yes, indeed. So I think, that there are two aspects to immigration, or at least, the kind of immigration that I experienced, which was somewhere between immigration and exile. I mean, in other words, the decision to emigrate was my parents, and they had extremely good reasons for emigrating. But I felt it was not my decision. But the two aspects are, the book is called Lost in Translation. Lost in Translation partly was the connotation of entranced by translation, fascinated by it. But there are two aspects to the translation. There is the translation into the new language. And really, it was the project of my young life to make English inhabit me the way that Polish had inhabited me. I mean, I was young, I was 13, so learning the language, to be able to converse in it, to be able to study in it, was not so difficult. But for the language to penetrate the psyche, to become part of the internal life, took a much longer time. But I really wanted to have the same kind of relationship to English that I had to Polish. In other words, that it was my psychic home, really. But the other aspect of it is transculturation. It's learning the new culture. It's learning about the new culture. First of all, we were emigrating from Poland to Canada during the Cold War period. In other words, we were emigrating from that east to that west, from behind the Iron Curtain to Canada, to the New World. The differences in cultures were then perhaps greater than what we can imagine today. Somebody was saying that the differences between cultures are lessening, and they are, partly because of the internet, partly because of global movements. We are very aware of other cultures, and the differences are not so enormous. But the differences there were quite enormous. And the differences in culture extend not only, let us say, to food or habits or ways of expression, they extend actually to forms of personhood, to the kinds of feelings that we value or we don't, to the kinds of relations with others that we value or that we don't. So that, for example, American culture, I went from Canada to the States to study 3.5 years after coming to Canada. American culture, of course, valued individuality and self-reliance greatly. And I learned a lot from it eventually. I really did learn a lot from it. Polish culture valued intimacy and closeness. Americans valued a certain kind of assertiveness, a certain kind of decisiveness. Poles valued a certain kind of sensibility. So yes, all of that needed to be decoded, needed to be understood. And it is the immigrant position that you have a kind of perspective on the culture of entry, on the second culture. And so, gradually I tried to decode the sort of the deep structures, the deep language of the second culture. And it was actually quite a complicated process. And I think it happened through various kinds of dialogues. Dialogues with friends, dialogues with teachers, internal dialogues in which I kept comparing, certain experiences in English to what they might have been in Polish and trying to figure out, how they compared and how they could be translated. But yes, I think, that almost every immigrant is a natural anthropologist, that you do have to observe and you have to decode and you have to understand from a kind of oblique perspective, a kind of distance, which is an advantage for a writer, by the way, but perhaps that's another question.
And at the end you won because English became a real part of you.
Yes, as I say, it was really, the project of my young life to make English inhabit my psyche. And eventually, I think it really did. I think I did translate myself into English, and there were sort of salient moments in this. I remember the moment when I first really heard the music of English poetry. It was a T.S. Eliot poem. It was actually very understated music, but I really heard the music of it, and it made me feel actually very happy. I remember my first dreams in English, and when I woke up again, dreams are sort of quite amazing. Anyway, I remember one dream which said, the cottage is the heart of desire, it is the sun itself which stokes the fire. Now, never would I have thought of something like that in my conscious life. Never would I have thought of something in rhyme. So, so I understood that the language really had sunk in very deeply, had penetrated the psyche and even perhaps the unconscious.
Thank you.